Since I keep trying to bring up new media theory, I figured it would be best for me to just put it out in a video and lay it out as I see it, since I believe it could help examine why Star Wars and Marvel are in the state they are nowadays under the management of Disney. Let me lay out the utility, or at least my adaptation of this theory for all this fun stuff on YouTube. So to start off, there are certain cycles in media as a technology, and there are even similar cycles to particular genres within the media across film that has been out there since, relatively speaking, it is a relatively new technology, only been around 100 years. Since I'm sort of an anime geek, let me use the process of alchemy as outlined in Full Metal Alchemist to sort of serve as an example and highlight this process. Now you have the genre as it exists currently. Next you have the breakdown of the genre, better known as deconstruction. Then you have the reconstruction of that genre that sort of gives it a new form using the elements from how it existed previously to update it for, I know people are gonna hate this, a modern audience. Take the superhero genre. You have tons of movies trying to bring them onto the screen for years. Now, out of all of them, you sort of have some success with the superhero movies in the Christopher Reeve eras in the late 70s. Then in the late 80s/90s, you had the Batman movies with Keaton. Finally, we have the MCU in the 2000s. Now the MCU was truly a peak for the genre. Almost a revolutionary idea of interspersing, interlinking all these super movies together within one universe. But frankly, that can only go on for so long without growing stale. That's where deconstruction comes in. Now, deconstruction can come in many different forms. Even parodies or spoofs can serve that purpose. For example, the OG Spider-Man trilogy and even Star Wars trilogy has the sort of spoof counterparts with a superhero movie, which was a little bit lame, probably a fail there, and Spaceballs. Now in actual comic books, Watchmen sort of served that purpose, but there was also another comic book that probably wasn't as successful comic book wise, actually several, but one that was sort of adapted that could serve the same purpose as the MCU. In fact, there's way too many people trying to deconstruct the superhero genre in my opinion, and a lot of them end up failures. I'm not saying The Boys is super great or super successful, but it's definitely a decent deconstruction of the superhero genre in nowadays. To what degree, that's up to the subjective point of view. But it should serve the purpose of this to highlight the deconstruction phase well enough for modern viewers of media. Much like with a lot of his other movies, such as Knives Out and Glass Onion, this almost seems to be what Rian Johnson, hell, maybe even JJ in a certain extent with the nostalgia bait, but that's probably taken it too far, almost seemed like they were trying to do here, to deconstruct the mythos and story of Star Wars, and within the mainline Star Wars movies, which I think was a really big cosmic mistake. You can even find this in the people who actually, for some godforsaken reason, like the Jedi very much. They'll say it's subversive, a new take, blah, 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 blah. Some people say it's even would be better on its own outside of the trilogy. I don't know about that, but I think it would serve a much better purpose like Andor in that case with a different cast, not in the actual trilogy there. So frankly, I think this where consistency should matter. Now, I don't know how this thought process went through Johnson's head. Maybe he's also familiar with new media theory and he thought JJ was sort of reintroducing the same old tired trope in a new form and tried to do a deconstruction. but it was not planned out very well. And within a mainline trilogy, you sort of need to establish old lore, which wasn't really done very well, if at all, and expand on that mythos in a way that makes sense given the universe. But as most people know, that did not happen. It's really like Rian Johnson just took everything people expected to happen in a Star Wars movie and did the exact opposite. Now, there was a lot of people who actually liked Ryan's subverting expectations, but to do that, he had to make a lot of choices and a lot of changes to things that already have been established in the Star Wars universe. Well-constructed consistency, setup, and payoff were all sacrificed almost intentionally to create a movie that no one saw coming. Again, maybe independent from the Star Wars film, The Last Jedi adapted properly could have been considered somewhat good, maybe even great. It would have had to have some minor adjustments to it, and it might have even made a great parody or maybe a satire. Sorted out in that last one, subtlety is dead nowadays unless you directly spell everything out. You know, maybe something like that within the veins of Star Wars that wasn't quite as over the top as Spaceballs. Again, sort of like how Rian Johnson tried to satirize the old-time detective murder mysteries in his following film, Knives Out. Not that I would make a definitive claim about that without a proper analysis. The great villain who fucking gets into this position is just stupid. If he's stupid, why is he worth being a villain? Because it's a Rian Johnson movie and he likes to do the complete opposite of what's logical. It seems like most of the time from what I've seen. But I do believe that approach is lazy and unoriginal right and wide, since that movie seems to have just taken the tropes and cliches of the genre to set up certain expectations just to go through looper levels of illogical subversion, subvert the audience expectations that have been established within that movie. Now, these cycles, for the most part, won't tell you about individual movies unless they're using new technology to explore these new movies. Probably why most critics don't bring it up in conversation. It's a tool for really analyzing patterns in media. By itself, without a comparison, it does very little good. You can sometimes use other movies or other medium within the same genre to do a decent job, but that sort of gets iffy if you're not careful about that, at least in my opinion. There's just many factors you have to take into consideration to get this sort of new media theory to work properly, and it can really go off the rails in some cases if you take it too seriously. Take She-Hulk, for example. Clearly attempt to somewhat deconstruct the superhero genre in a certain form. Comedy works like that generally, but there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of that, and in theory they could have pulled off that series very well using the same cast, just making different choices to the world and other elements. Now, I really am reluctant to speculate on anything, but maybe the people creating She-Hulk understood the process of a deconstruction but didn't know exactly what they were trying to do with She-Hulk. At least I think that's a good theory that could explain what went wrong in She-Hulk in a lot of people's minds. Some people actually even like that show, but probably not for the best of reasons. Could be a multitude of different reasons overall, but I'm thinking maybe it is because they were trying to, inject a little bit of that intersectional feminism or something of a various offshoot of that particular philosophy, but you really shouldn't actually go full retard in a sort of deconstructive piece, as that could have turned out really well. Because frankly, taking the themes of a deconstruction too seriously is always a mistake. Deconstructions are better when they're breaking things apart, not when they're trying to put things back together in a serious manner. There might be some exceptions out there, but they're tend to be incredibly subtle and rather rare. Plus, it trying to integrate itself into the greater established universe that it should wish to keep relatively a consistent tone and logic and rules that apply evenly across the MCU, which overall definitely a failing of Disney not coordinate these better, so when they try to put them back together, it makes something a little bit more coherent overall, but that's besides the point. Now, this could, in theory at least, apply to The Last Jedi, but in reality, I think the issues interjected into that movie was so vague and really up to the subjective nature of the many interpretations that can be pulled out of it. It really doesn't do a lot and doesn't say anything, but it lets the audience project certain elements of their lives onto what they think are the themes of The Last Jedi. It really is a mess that is almost amazing in a certain way. Again, that's partially why I think that movie, at least in my opinion, was so badly made. Frankly, I think something like Star Wars Vision would have been a much better way to explore the sort of deconstruction of the Star Wars universe. That wouldn't have come off really that badly at all, but that's more of a case-by-case basis in that case. Maybe Marvel's If, or whatever it was called, could have done the same thing and did do the same thing a little bit too late, and I didn't really watch it, so can't really speak to that. Cartoons in general are a great medium to explore without going too deep and destroying the universe, non-canon so to speak, within this particular universe to explore these ideas and see what works and what doesn't. Now, I can't be sure, but I think maybe they sort of realized this, at least some people in Disney, after movies like Captain Marvel, that they really couldn't just push the demographic change with their audience from a primarily male one to this sort of thing without this deconstructive phase, but I'm probably giving them too much credit. And frankly, She-Hulk was a sloppy mess that was too little, too late, and came out way too strong, especially with Daredevil. Damn, man, feel bad for him. Plus, really, for deconstructions to work properly, you need the subject matter to be explored in a way that sort of relates to the medium that it's deconstructing by exploring the established codes and conventions of that particular genre or movie series in a subtle way before breaking it apart, not with the hammer that The Last Jedi took to that series. Now, why I brought up Spaceballs earlier, I really don't even think that was one of Mel Brooks' better satires / parodies. The Producers was definitely by far one of his more interesting pieces of writing. Springtime for Hitler and all that fun stuff. But I think a better example of this was Blazing Saddles, a movie people say couldn't be done today, with decent reason. And it is even a better example of how to get a genre piece to deal with matters that relate to identity politics in a much more nuanced and comical way. Probably why it's so offensive now. They pulled off something that a lot of people would like to do nowadays rather well. Again, probably gonna have to explore that in another video for another time. And now it almost seems like Disney is trying to return to, this sort of proper form with things like The Mandalorian, but you also have things like Obi-Wan Kenobi. That is a messy mix of both the new and old that doesn't quite really work out. They definitely have hints of the old and they integrate the new in with it haphazardly, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Not that either of those shows are great by most top tier standards out there. They do the job to a certain degree and can be enjoyable to a certain extent. Still, there are many elements included in each of them that could work, at least in theory, but frankly, I think they're combined in a rather messy way, and that logic the cognitive dissonance of the old and new and how they're constructed together can hurt the overall experience for people who pay more attention and doesn't get distracted by the member berries and superficial elements of these shows. Endor got more praise, but that's almost more because it wasn't trying to wear the identity of Star Wars like a skin suit. Now, all three of those shows are just some good examples of shows that started off rather strong, rather successful, at least in the mind of many, but they have sort of identity problems with what they're trying to be, and continuing them successfully becomes rather difficult due to the weak foundation of each show. Now, can they get back on track like they tried to do with, I believe, Picard and Star Trek? At least that's what I hear. Or are they going to continue in this direction or just peter out? Really, only time will tell, and the money they can pump into these shows. Now, none of this really explains why a movie or television show is bad, but it can explain the thought process that seems to have gone into the shows and how this sort of process works when there's a lopsided skipping of a proper deconstruction to get to the reintroduction of what Star Wars is in this modern era. This is why I do believe some of these shows get heavy criticism from at least a vocal minority of people who care about storytelling and other elements that have been left from the wayside with the rather over-reliance on visual effects to sort of replace some of the story elements that were more traditionally set up there. Seems almost to be a magic trick to try to not have general audience members see the flaws of these particular shows or movies by dazzling them and not tricking them per se, but wowing them visually so they don't think too deeply about the littler details that other people will focus on. And I really think this is because Disney did not take the proper steps to break down the genre and build it back up properly again. Some people caught up with it, but you have older fans and people who are trying to follow along sort of lost in the wayside when you don't take the proper steps to get from there to here. At least that's my belief on why that is. Now, even though I think most of Disney's Star Wars is weak foundation and improperly constructed from the start, there are ways for both Star Wars and the MCU to sort of build themselves back up. You need to have some elements slowly introduced and create the more solid foundation, or maybe they just need to destroy and be resurrected later, or maybe they just need to die off for a bit, get out of the cultural zeitgeist, and come back later with more planning and proper construction to them. In short, you might be able to push all this stuff on a lot of people in the public with good enough marketing and other elements, but there will be some people who will want the proper steps to change these IPs and even the genres to something that somewhat resembles those things in the glory days. I really hate that term, but you know what? I do believe there is a way to salvage it, but I don't know what I would do to take that. And that also seems to be the general problem with what people are calling woke nowadays. At least that's what looking at these particular media properties through new media theory sort of tells me about them. Still, it really is much easier to understand and say, go woke, go broke, even though that does not take the construction of each of these woke things into consideration when they're being made. You're poisoning the well for the rest by having certain bad writing, production in general, and casting, and definitely executives sort of meddling within the affairs. But you'll get some woke things that will be good at some point in the future. They just have to be adapted properly and take the proper steps to construct them. And with that said, I'm done.